Hey, this is Zulem Urbina, and tune into the relay for the latest news in boxing all around the world. Thank you for supporting myself and other female boxers. We truly appreciate it.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Well, obviously, I want the rematch with Shani. That's what everyone wants, not just me. I know I want it. The fans want it. Pretty sure Eddie Hearn wants it. I've said it, the only one that doesn't want it is her. So, hopefully she wants it. But then again, she's on her journey and I've got to focus on me.
Shannon Courtenay's comments are pretty funny. They're funny because she says she won't do a rematch. She won't do a sequel with Ebony unless Ebony gets herself a world title, and yet the girl that Shannon is fighting isn't a world champion, Jamie Mitchell. Don't get me wrong, I like the Jamie Mitchell fight and I look forward to seeing it, but it's strange hearing Shannon say that she won't give Ebony another shot unless she picks up a world title of her own.
Why? You ain't fighting world champions.
It's nothing against Jamie Mitchell. It's nothing against the Jamie Mitchell fight, but Jamie Mitchell, as a fighter, isn't head and shoulders above Ebony Bridges.
She isn't as well known.
She's not actually that much more experienced as a professional than Ebony is, yet that is who Shannon Courtenay is going to be fighting in her very next fight.
She's telling Ebony Bridges to get a belt.
A difficult task in the women's bantamweight division. During the broadcast, I heard one of the commentators say that the women's bantamweight division lacks depth. And I don't know if the commentator said that due to either ignorance or willful omission.
You pretending there aren't better fighters out there?
Better fights with better fighters for both Shannon and Ebony. You pretending these other girls, they don't exist?
I don't even know.
What I do know is that Shannon Courtenay is making a rematch with Ebony Bridges contingent upon Ebony Bridges procuring a world title of her own. So we then have to look at what world champions are out there in the boxing cosmos of the women's bantamweight division, and which one of them does Ebony Bridges stand the best chance winning a world title from? I'll tell you, and I'm just being honest, I don't like Ebony Bridges' chances here and now against Mexico's own Julie Hang Luna, the reigning WBC women's bantamweight champion, who became the bantamweight champion by unseating none other than Bobby Juarez.
She's too much for Ebony right now.
I think that if the goal is to get Ebony Bridges a world title of her own, so she can then challenge Shannon Courtenay for a second time in what would be a unification match, I think that Ebony stands a better chance against Maria Cecilia Roman than Julie Hang. Don't misunderstand me. That's not saying that Maria Cecilia Roman would be some walk in the park for the Blonde Bomber. That Maria Cecilia Roman would be some walk in the park for Ebony Bridges. No, Ebony would really have to work for it against Argentinia's own IBF champion, Maria Cecilia Roman. I think Ebony stands a better chance, comparatively, beating Maria Cecilia Roman than Julie Hang Luna. A totem pole of most risky to least risky. I'd say Julie Hang Luna is the most risky fight out there for Ebony Bridges as far as picking up a world title. It would be Julie Hang Luna at the top of Mexico. Denmark's own two-division champion, Dina Thorsland. She'd be the second most risky fight. The third would be Maria and Shannon Courtenay out of the four active reigning world champions in the women's bantamweight division. Shannon would be the least risky fight for Ebony.
Telling you, it's not going to be easy.
It isn't, because Ebony does need more seasoning, more grooming as a professional. And ideally, what you would do now that Ebony has had her rebound fight with Beck Connolly is put her in there with perhaps a world title challenger like a Joseph Noriega, a seasoned contender in an Estrella Valverde, somebody who's been around the block a few times, can pose some resistance.
Give Ebony something to work around.
Without Ebony being in over her head. Ideally, this would be the pecking order. And I'm not sure what's going to happen next. I'm not sure where we go from here. Because if what Shannon Courtenay is saying is she ain't doing no rematch with Ebony until Ebony gets herself a belt, it then becomes about getting Ebony a belt.
It's not easy to do it, bantamweight.
It really isn't. Ebony and Shannon are in a very similar place as far as professional experience goes, and Shannon Courtenay had the good fortune of picking up that vacant WBA title.
There ain't no more vacant titles lying around.
And if Shannon Courtenay sticks to her guns, Ebony's gonna have to go through somebody to get a world title of her own.
I don't know if she's ready to do that.
She advanced to a professional record of 6 wins, 1 loss, with 3 knockouts. this past weekend, and congratulations to her, but in terms of winning world titles from world champions, yes, there's more work that needs doing. Just in keeping with the theme of what happens next for yesterday's combatants, those guys, gals that were in action in the second installment of the Fight Camp series, Season 2, Kid Galahad, post-fight, was quoted as saying, Warrington would leave on a stretcher if I fight him. IBF champion Galahad, Warrington and Lara would both leave on a stretcher if I fought them. IBF champion Kid Galahad, after super display against Dickens. And, a lot of people, they thought
Kid Galahad did enough.
back when Josh Warrington still was the IBF's featherweight champion, there were a lot of people that thought that Kid Galahad had done enough to earn a decision. He wasn't awarded one, but there were still a lot of people that thought that.
Some time passes.
Kid Galahad becomes the mandatory challenger to Josh Warrington's IBF title. The fight gets ordered, and Josh Warrington decides to chuck the title, drop it.
Skip the rematch.
How are you supposed to interpret that? You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of when the WBO ordered that fight, that rematch, I should say, between the then reigning champion, WBO champion at Super Flyweight, Donnie Nietes, and Ashton Palikte. Donnie, he decided to drop his WBO title ahead of that order.
The same way Josh Warrington did.
And Donnie's reasoning for doing so was that he was going to pursue bigger fights with bigger names out there. That hasn't actually happened yet,
Donnie falls off the grid for a while.
The WBO ordered that fight, and Donnie Nietes decided to drop that WBO title in late February of 2019. He disappears for roughly 2 years because we don't see this guy until March of 2021. He fights Pablo Carrillo. Not exactly a big fight now, was it? You just get the sense that Donnie was trying to dodge a bullet, and that same hierarchy of thought might apply to Josh Warrington. Josh, when he was an unbeaten fighter, an unbeaten champion, he dropped that title so that he could dodge a bullet in that Kid Galahad rematch. And my, how the tables have turned, because now Kid Galahad is the reigning IBF champion. And it feels like
the universe is bringing these guys together.
a lot has happened since then. Josh dropped the title. He was subsequently upset by Mauricio Lara, and he's going to be having a rematch with that guy in September. Even if he makes it through that rematch.
Some people don't think he will.
Some people saw that beating that Mauricio Lara put on Josh Warrington, and they feel that Josh won't recover. We'll see how that story plays out. And if it plays out to where Josh actually manages to avenge the loss to Mauricio, what does he do after that?
Where does he go?
I got nothing against Josh Warrington. He's always been a very fun fighter to watch. But you know what he's not? He's not a power puncher, and he's not the biggest guy, even as far as featherweights go. Moving up to super featherweight, that's not an option for Josh. He has neither the size or the punching power to bang with those kids
You
upstairs.
see what Mauricio Lara did to him?
That was at featherweight. That was at 126 pounds. What would they do to Josh at 130? Moving up for Josh Warrington, it's really not an option. He's got to stay in the featherweight division, but even if he does that, who does he fight? What other avenues of opportunity to become a world champion again are there for Josh? The WBC and WBA titles, they're being held hostage over there on PBC's Isolation Island. Gary Russell still is this division's WBC champion, and Leo Santa Cruz still is this division's WBA champion. Good luck getting a fight with those fucking guys.
And even if he could, who says he wins?
You could see about getting a fight with that division's reigning WBO champion, Emmanuel Navarrete, but do you really want a fight with Emmanuel Navarrete? Comparatively, you'd be better off taking your chances with Kid Galahad for a second time than challenging Emmanuel Navarrete for that WBO title. You see what Mauricio Lara did to you? Emmanuel, he'd do that, but worse.
And underneath it all, I think his people know that.
That's what I mean when I say that it feels like the universe is bringing these two guys back together. As strange as this might sound, a rematch with Kid Galahad for the IBF title is the safest choice for Josh Warrington at this point. But first, before anything, before it even comes to that, he's got to make it through Mauricio Lara.
Josh has got his work cut out for him.
There's no two ways about it. The road to becoming a two-time featherweight champion really is a difficult one for Josh Warrington. He's going to have to go through something, and he's going to have to go through someone. In other news, WBA welterweight super champion Yordenis Ugas took to his social media and said, I had a fight signed against Spence for many months. Pacquiao came back and took that fight. I have nothing against Spence. I take a bigger fight and against a legend. If he doesn't underestimate Pacquiao like Thurman did, I think he will win the biggest victory of his career. It says a lot about his career that the victory the biggest one he could have,
Is against an old man.
Listen, don't get me wrong. Manny Pacquiao is a living legend, but what he also is a 42-year-old inactive fighter.
He hasn't fought in 2 whole years.
And if this is anything, this is a passing of the torch fight.
At most, that's what it is.
How much credit are you supposed to give Errol Spence Jr. for taking on a 42-year-old Manny Pacquiao who hasn't fought in the last 2 years? 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago, people were saying that Floyd Mayweather Jr. waited till Manny was out of his prime and past it in order to fight him and in order to beat him. This was the narrative roughly 5, maybe close to 6 years ago. So what's Manny 5 or 6 years later?
I don't agree with that narrative.
I never have, because from where I'm sitting, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Floyd Mayweather Jr. is an older fighter than Manny Pacquiao is, roughly 2 years older than Manny Pacquiao. So while Manny Pacquiao is aging over time, so was Floyd.
Better still.
5 years ago, in some circles, Manny Pacquiao was viewed as an aging fighter who was past his best. Some time passes and he takes on Jeff Horn.
The decision was controversial.
But regardless of what you feel about the decision, in many circles, the one thing everybody agreed on is that Manny looked his age.
He looked old.
And afterwards, Manny Pacquiao managed to get himself back in the winner's bracket by facing Lucas Mathise and retiring Lucas Mathise.
He was past it.
Manny strikes a deal with PBC and kicks it off by fighting Adrian Bronier, who at that point...
Bronier.
Adrian Broner. By the time Manny Pacquiao finally got his hands on Adrian Broner, getting his hands on Adrian Broner didn't actually mean anything. Adrian Broner hasn't been an elite level anything for years, aside from an elite level troll, maybe.
I think about the last couple of years.
Manny Pacquiao ends up fighting the sparsely active, injury-prone Keith Thurman, who also has sat out the last 2 years, hasn't had a fight. And, you know, it was a great win for Manny, I'd say. It really was. It only adds to his already robust legacy.
Which is set in stone.
Already. Potentially losing to Errol Spence Jr. in a matter of weeks. It won't take anything away from Manny Pacquiao's already robust legacy and what he's done so far.
It won't.
And, you know, when I hear Yordenis Ugas talking about this fight in this context, I think to myself, the only one with anything to gain here is Manny Pacquiao, because the circumstances are very different for Errol Spence Jr. Errol Spence Jr. is in his prime. He beats Manny. The most that proves is that he can beat a 42-year-old inactive fighter.
You say this is the biggest fight of his career.
Yeah, maybe in terms of finance, maybe financially, it is the biggest fight of his career. But as far as legacy fights go, I can't say wholeheartedly, hand on heart, that that's what this is. At most, what I see here is a potential crossover fight between a young fighter who's in his prime and a past-it fighter who's on the verge of retirement.
But still has a lot of marquee value.
Which really is the only reason that this fight is as big as it is. It's not because of Errol, it's because of Manny.
He didn't do earth-shattering numbers with Porter.
Or Danny. Since the Mikey Garcia fight, which was Errol Spence Jr.'s pay-per-view debut, the numbers have shown a downward trend. He's not on the up and up. If this pay-per-view is a success, if this set of pay-per-view buys is much better than the last two, you have Manny Pacquiao to thank for that.
And this is a legacy fight for Manny.
A lot more than it's a legacy fight for Errol.
Because I doubt at 42 years old Errol would do what Manny's doing right now.
And that's what resonated with me as I read through Yordenis Ugas' tweet. That's what came to mind. The other thing that came to mind is what it revealed. That Yordenis Ugas, in his own words, had signed a fight against Spence for many months. Pacquiao came back, and he took that fight. Essentially, what that means is that Spence versus Ugas was a done deal up until recently, up until Manny Pacquiao became available.
There was never any official announcement.
They never officially announced a unification match between Errol Spence Jr. and Yordenis Ugas, but that is what most of us were expecting, and at least according to Yordenis Ugas, that was what was going to happen. Reading this, it further fueled my suspicions about what really happened with Manny Pacquiao and the WBA, that if the WBA seemed very Johnny on the spot, very quick to rescind Manny Pacquiao's status as a full champion, it's because they're in some ways colluding with the PBC. Manny Pacquiao was set to leave the island. In many ways, he did leave the island. because
He jumped into bed with Paradigm.
there were all sorts of rumors and all sorts of rumblings about all these different fucking fights. A Mikey Garcia fight on his own, a crossover fight with Conor McGregor, a potential Ryan Garcia fight, potential Terrence Crawford fight in the Far East.
Manny left the fucking island.
I think that when the people over there at the PBC saw that Manny Pacquiao had left the island and he had other plans to do other things with other outfits, they got on the phone with Gilberto Mendoza and told Gilberto to strip Manny Pacquiao and rescind his status as a full-fledged champion. They were going to make sure that if Manny leaves the island, he don't leave with that title. They want that to stay in-house.
You see what Ugas is saying?
Yordenis Ugas was elevated to WBA Super Champion months ago. Coincidentally, Yordenis Ugas himself is saying that the Spence fight was signed months ago.
He was elevated to Super Champion in January.
I believe that as soon as Manny Pacquiao left the island, as soon as Manny left the reservation, the PBC made sure that he don't leave with that WBA title. He don't leave with that status. It's going to go to one of their other fighters because the PBC and the WBA have got something going on.
Call it a contingency plan.
Plan B for the PBC. You know, very recently, Manny Pacquiao petitioned to be reinstated as WBA champion. To my surprise, he was denied, and I thought to myself, why would the WBA decide to deny Manny Pacquiao?
I was expecting them to give him his belt back.
And then I thought to myself, in all my wisdom, I says, well, you know, what if Manny does the unthinkable, the way he did with Keith Thurman? What if Manny actually wins? What if he goes in there and knocks out Errol Spence Jr.? The PBC will still have an ace in the hole with Yordenis Ugas. They'll still have a champion. They'll still have a belt in the welterweight division. Listen, Errol Spence Jr. on points is the conservative prediction for more reasons than one. Yeah, there's Manny's age and the inactivity. There's that to consider. But there's also the political stuff. That perhaps the deck is stacked against Manny Pacquiao. That he can't win a decision because they're invested in Errol Spence Jr.
Manny's got to knock him out.
When is the last time that Manny Pacquiao knocked somebody out? I'm just giving it to you straight. It's the only way I know how to give it to you. I'm not telling you that Manny will or won't knock out Errol Spence Jr., but this is the lay of the land. I'm getting the impression that the only way Manny Pacquiao wins this fight is if he goes in there and knocks out Errol Spence Jr., because he won't win on points.
You see what happened last night between Fox and Maestre?
You saw what happened between Romero and Marinez. Broner and Santiago, Rodriguez and Gaballo. Hell, even the Wilder versus Fury card was controversial. The one from the first fight.
117-111 in the Charlo fight.
The way fights get scored over there on PBC's Isolation Island borders on a sitcom, a situation comedy, more than an actual boxing match. And people, they are starting to notice. So when I think about the Pacquiao versus Spence fight, what resonates with me the most is Manny's got to knock the guy out to win the fight, because they may not give him a decision even if he deserves one. They're invested in Errol.
They need him to win this fight.